6 wives passed through Henry VIII's life like chapters written in velvet and blood. And still, one question whispers through 5 centuries: who did he truly love? They say it was Jane Seymour, the sweet queen who gave him a son and lies beside him in death. But love in Henry's world was never simple. It was obsession, possession, and fear. And the closer you look, the more it seems the woman who earned his heart wasn't the one who gave him peace, but the one who made him ruin everything. Most people say it was Jane Seymour. Well, she gave him the long-awaited son, Prince Edward. Henry later chose to be buried beside her at Windsor. He even called her his true wife. Sounds like a closed case, right? But here's the problem. Henry's words were often theatre. His actions were the confession. And when you track what he did across his life, the picture gets messy fast. Henry didn't stay the same man. He lived 3 versions of himself, young Henry. The romantic prince who loved attention and charm. Middle Henry, the desperate king who needed an heir and would tear the world apart to get one. Old Henry, the wounded tyrant who wanted control and comfort more than passion. Love, for Henry, was never one thing. It shifted depending on what he needed. So instead of asking who was sweetest, let's ask something sharper. Which wife truly held power over Henry's heart and decisions? Which woman made him rewrite the rules of England itself? Because there was one wife who didn't just share his bed, she changed his kingdom. And that kind of influence does not come from polite affection. Let's start where everyone expects, Jane Seymour. She arrives in Henry's story in 1536 like a quiet pause after a storm. Compared to Anne Boleyn's fire, Jane seems gentle, obedient, and safe. Henry married her in May 1536. Shockingly fast. Anne's execution happened on 19 May. Henry and Jane's marriage followed just days later. The timing alone tells you Henry was not in a mourning state of mind. He was moving forward like a man who needed the past erased. Jane fit what Henry wanted at that moment. She did not challenge him in public. She did not argue politics and push for influence the way Catherine of Aragon could. She did not spar with him intellectually the way Anne Boleyn did. Jane's power was quiet, compliance, nod, smile, agree, soothe. After years of conflict and court factions, she looked like peace. Then in October 1537, at Hampton Court, she gave him what every wife before her had failed to deliver, a legitimate son. Edward was born on 12 October 1537, after a brutal labour that lasted days. The court celebrated like England itself had been saved. But Jane barely got to live in the victory. Within days she fell ill, likely from postnatal infection, and she died on 24 October 1537. Now look at Henry's response. He gave Jane the most magnificent queen's funeral any of his wives received. The whole court wore mourning black for months. Henry withdrew, visibly shaken, and later, when he planned his tomb, he chose Jane as his eternal companion. That burial choice is why people call Jane the favorite. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Jane became perfect because she died before she could disappoint him. Henry's love was often conditional. Catherine of Aragon failed to give him surviving sons. Anne Boleyn gave him a daughter, then miscarriages, and she challenged him constantly. Catherine Howard wrought scandal. In Henry's world, a wife could fall from beloved to enemy shockingly fast. Jane never had time to become a problem. She produced Edward then vanished from Henry's daily life before politics. Personality or aging could complicate the fantasy. Jane froze in Henry's mind as the wife who delivered the heir without ever demanding anything in return. That is not only love, that is convenience wrapped in grief. So if Jane is the safe answer, who is the dangerous one? The wife who made Henry do impossible things. The wife who made him break with Rome, risk rebellion, and split England in half. Because that level of obsession is not explained by she was nice. This is where the story turns toward Anne Boleyn. And before anyone says, but he killed her, remember, execution does not prove the absence of love. In Henry's world, love and punishment often lived side by side. He could desire a woman fiercely, then destroy her when she stopped meeting his needs or threatened his control. If you want to understand Henry's heart, you don't start with the wife he buried beside him. You start with the wife who made him unrecognizable to the world and to himself. It's a Tucson femhundred Jugosex in England. Henry is about 35, married to Catherine of Aragon for nearly 2 decades. By royal standards, it's stable. Catherine is respected, intelligent, and politically capable. But stability was never enough for a king haunted by one obsession, a male heir. Then Anne Boleyn enters the center of his vision. Contemporary observers didn't always describe her as the most beautiful woman at court, but beauty was not the main weapon. Anne had wit that cut fast, confidence that didn't tremble, and a mind sharp enough to match Henry's own. Most dangerously, she understood how to control a king's appetite. Henry wanted Anne as a mistress. That was normal. That was manageable. Anne refused. When he sent gifts, she sent them back. When he pushed, she delayed. When he wrote love letters, she answered in ways that kept him chasing. She didn't just say no once. She built her entire position on making the most powerful man in England feel like a desperate suitor, and Henry fell for it completely. For 7 years, Anne made the King of England behave like a man who could not breathe without her attention. That is not a small romance. That is obsession. Henry wrote to her, not like a ruler, but like a pleading lover, asking her to show her true feelings, begging for reassurance. That tone matters because it shows you the emotional imbalance. Anne had power over Henry's desire in a way no other wife ever did. Now watch the consequences. Henry didn't just rearrange his household to be near Anne. He rearranged his entire country. He broke with Rome. He challenged the Pope. He dismantled monasteries. He risked international war, all for one woman who kept him hungry. That level of sacrifice is the strongest evidence of all. People argue Jane was his favorite because she gave him a son. But Anne was the wife who made him destroy what he'd built just to have her. That is not calm affection. That is dangerous love. And the tragedy is, even after Henry finally married Anne in 1533, the obsession didn't neatly turn into happiness. Anne gave him Elizabeth. Not the son, he demanded. The court grew more hostile. Pressure increased. Their relationship turned sharp, tenser, sometimes cruel. Anne's strength was still there. The same strength that first attracted Henry, but now Henry experienced it as resistance. W 1536, Henry's emotional needs changed. He stopped wanting a partner who challenged him. He wanted a wife who soothed his ego and did not expose his insecurity. That is when Jane Seymour became useful. But useful and loved are not always the same. Here's the part most people miss, even after Anne's execution. The shadow of Anne didn't disappear. Historians often focus on the public story she was condemned. Her marriage erased, and Henry moved on. But privately, Henry's behavior suggests something more complicated. There are references in sources to Henry's lingering fixation on what Anne represented: youth, desire, the thrill of being pursued and denied. Anne made him feel alive in a way no obedient marriage ever could. This is why the question, who did Henry love most, is so hard. Henry could claim Jane was his true wife, because that claim served his image and his legacy. But his most transformative passion was Anne, the wife who made him reckless, the wife who made him gamble his soul and his kingdom. And then there's another contender who confuses the whole debate, Catherine Parr. Not the youthful obsession, not the gentle mother, but the woman who mastered the older Henry and survived. Fast forward to July 1543. Henry is 52 and no longer the Golden Prince. He is physically failing, suffering chronic pain from a leg ulcer, heavier, unclear, more suspicious. He is already married and discarded multiple wives. At this stage, Henry is not chasing romance. He is chasing control, comfort, and a kind of loyalty that won't embarrass him. Enter Catherine Parr. She is not a teenage bride like Catherine Howard. She is not a quiet symbol like Jane Seymour. She is educated, politically aware, and confident enough to speak to Henry as something close to an equal. Catherine reads theology, writes debatis, and understands how power works. This is where Catherine becomes unique. Henry did not simply marry her for companionship. He leaned on her. He trusted her in ways he did not trust others. Catherine became the stabilizing force in a household full of old wounds, Mary resentful and damaged by what happened to her mother, Elizabeth brilliant and always a reminder of Anne Boleyn, and young Edward fragile and precious. Catherine managed what Henry had repeatedly failed to manage. She created something that looked like a family. Then comes the moment that reveals Catherine's intelligence. In 1546, conservative enemies convinced Henry that Catherine's religious ideas were too Protestant and too dangerous. An arrest warrant was prepared. Men were sent. This is the point where most wives would panic, cry, plead, or flee. Catherine did something colder and smarter. She went directly to Henry, looked him in the eye, and reframed the entire situation as flattery. She claimed her debates were not challenges, but a way to learn from his superior wisdom. It fed Henry's ego perfectly, and it saved her life. Henry tore up the warrant. Now ask yourself, what kind of love is this? It's not poetic romance. It's survival mixed with partnership. Catherine understood Henry's pride and how to handle it without losing herself. Look at the privileges Henry gave her. Catherine was the only wife he allowed to publish books under her own name. She wasn't simply permitted to read, she was permitted to speak. Henry also trusted her as regent when he went to war in France, placing the kingdom's management in her hands. That is not a small favor. That is a signal of trust. More telling, Catherine was the only wife Henry trusted with all 3 children. She wasn't only a caretaker for Edward. She became a bridge for Mary and Elizabeth too. Catherine helped soften Henry toward his daughters and played a role in restoring them to the line of succession. She did what no romantic obsession ever achieved. She stabilized Henry's legacy. When Henry died in January 1547, he left Catherine an extremely generous settlement, including income and property. But perhaps the clearest clue is political, when Henry rewrote his will in December 1546. Just weeks before his death, he made Catherine Parr one of the key executors of his final wishes. That position required confidence in her judgment and loyalty. So if Jane represents the wife Henry idealized in death, and Anne represents the wife Henry obsessed over in life, Catherine represents something else, the wife who mastered the reality of Henry VIII and lived to tell the tale. But does favorite mean the one who gave him peace, or the one who made him burn down his world? That's the heart of the debate. If you define love as passion, obsession, and sacrifice, Anne Boleyn has the strongest claim. Henry pursued her for years, wrote desperate letters, and dismantled England's religious relationship with Rome to marry her. That is the behavior of a man consumed. If you define love as idealization and legacy, Jane Seymour looks like the answer Henry wanted history to repeat. He honored her in death, mourned her publicly, and chose her for his tomb. Jane gave him Edward, then died before she could become a disappointment. Henry could preserve her as the perfect wife because she never lived long enough to test the fantasy. If you define love as trust, partnership, and deep dependence, Catherine Parr becomes the quiet winner. She navigated Henry's terrifying final years, protected herself, protected his children, and was rewarded with influence and authority no other wife enjoyed. Catherine's relationship with Henry wasn't about making him feel young. It was about managing the monster he had become. And in Tudor terms, surviving that role is extraordinary. There's also a darker possibility. What if Henry wasn't capable of consistent love at all? What if his marriages were mirrors, reflecting his needs at different ages? Young Henry wanted excitement and conquest. Middle Henry wanted a son and confirmation that God favored him. Old Henry wanted obedience, carré, and control over his legacy. Each wife served a different hunger. That idea doesn't erase emotion. Henry could feel strongly, but his feelings were often tangled with power. Love, to him, could turn into punishment the moment it stopped serving him. So when people ask, who did Henry love most? The honest answer might be, it depends on which Henry you mean, the romantic, the desperate, or the tyrant, and each version points to a different woman. Let's bring it to one final action that many people overlook after Henry's death. Catherine Parr did not collapse into a life of mourning the way a perfect favorite widow would. 6 months later, she married Thomas Seymour, the man she had cared about before Henry claimed her. That alone tells you Catherine never fully disappeared into Henry's story. But that marriage also shows the risk Catherine was willing to take once Henry's shadow was gone. She wanted a life that belonged to her, not to the crown. She became pregnant, had a child, published more writing, and stepped into something like freedom for the first time in years. Her ending is tragic. She died in 1548, not long after giving birth, but she died as herself, not as Henry's wife, and that might be the sharpest conclusion of all. If Henry's favorite is the wife who best served his emotional needs, you can argue for Jane or Catherine. If Henry's true love is the woman who truly captured him, ruined his peace, and rewired his kingdom, Anne Boleyn is difficult to beat. So here's the real twist. Maybe the answer isn't about who Henry loved most in a sweet way. Maybe it's about Which wife had the greatest hold over him at the most important moment? Anne reshaped England. Jane secured the male heir. Catherine stabilized the dynasty and survived the tyrant. Now, I want to hear your take. Which wife do you think truly captured Henry's heart? And which one do you personally feel for the most? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you want more Tudor love drama with the darker truth kept intact, like and subscribe so you don't miss the next story.